and you know exactly where it is, and you told him exactly where it is, and it is exactly where it was supposed to be, but he can't see it. And he spends all kinds of time, supposedly, looking for it, and yet it was right there the whole time. And I think that little analogy is true sometimes with us spiritually. That there are moments in our lives where God is right, He's right there. He's in plain sight. Everything we need to know and to appreciate and to gain an understanding of what God wants from us, what He's doing for us, what He's providing for us, it is right in front of us the whole time. And yet, just like this description here in Mark chapter 4, we are like those who see but don't perceive. We hear but we don't understand because we don't give any diligence or any effort or don't take the time to appreciate what's right in front of us. And this morning, if you would, I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about that issue and maybe illustrate that from some examples within Scripture of how it is that there have been many occasions in the history of man where God was in plain sight and yet men refused to see what was evidenced and what was obvious and what was right in front of them. And if you would, I want to take you back into the Old Testament for a moment, and I just want us to appreciate this morning this idea of, are we able to and willing to see the presence of God when He's more obvious than sometimes we admit to? Go back into the book of Exodus, if you will. I'll spend a little time there at the outset of our study this morning, and go into Exodus chapter 14. You recall this narrative of the great exodus out of Egypt as Moses is leading God's children from that years of bondage and challenge there in Egypt, and He's leading them back into the promised land, and He's been delivering them throughout that process. They've already witnessed the plagues and the things that God has power to do in order to get Pharaoh to finally let them go. And here in chapter 14, notice that he says to the Lord, now the Lord spoke to Moses saying, verse 1, "Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp before I'll never say that right, that place, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon, you shall camp before it by the sea." Now pause for just a minute. Notice that they were going in one direction, and Moses is told by the Lord, I want you to turn the people into a different direction. Keep that in mind. Keep reading. Verse 3, "For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are bewildered by the land, the wilderness has closed them up. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all the army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord," and they did so. Can you and I appreciate this morning that God tells Moses, you tell the people that they need to turn in a different direction, and when they make that turn, they're going to put themselves in a situation where they're actually vulnerable. They're basically going to turn, and by physical means, they're going to trap themselves in that situation. And God says, I'm doing that for a reason. Because Pharaoh's going to look at that, and he's going to decide, I can deal with them there. They're trapped in that situation that they're in, whether it be the sea on one side and the land masses around them. But I will demonstrate the power I have over Pharaoh by allowing you to turn even into a circumstance that doesn't seem to be too favorable, and allow you to appreciate the benefits of my power that I can provide for you. Jump over to verse 10 of this same text, and if while you're doing that, I'm going to do something that I forgot to do. No, it is on. That one's not on. I couldn't see anything in my Bible, and I couldn't figure out why, and there was this shadow coming from behind me. Verse 10 of chapter 14. "And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord." And so they look, and they use their eyes, and they see Pharaoh coming, and they begin to cry out, look at us, we're trapped. Why did he turn us into this circumstance? And now Pharaoh's pursuit is before us. Verse 11, "Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt?" Maybe you've read that verse before, but not recognized the context in which it's said. They make that statement because they believe that there is no hope now because Moses has led them into a trap. were in a position here, and keep in mind, we're not talking about a couple hundred folks. The estimates are roughly a couple million potentially people that came out of Egyptian bondage and were heading towards the promised land. So imagine this mass of people that have now been led to this spot where they are trapped on every side. And all they can see is Pharaoh's pursuits. Isn't this what we told you? Verse 12, is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. Can you imagine the people that had already witnessed the power of God through the plagues, and they've reached a point this early in their history of Exodus, that they have already decided that they would have been better off in bondage or dying? They felt like that was the only two options they had. Either be back enslaved to Egypt or just die. Those are the only two things they could see, even after all the things that God had provided and done for them. So Moses in verse 13 says to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. You see the Egyptians today, I'm telling you, God's going to get rid of them to a point where you'll not have to deal with them ever again. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. When the situation begins to create doubts in our lives, sometimes I think all we see are the doubts and the challenges, and all we see are the consequential kinds of things, and we don't lift our eyes up to see God. We lift our eyes only to the problems that are around us. Though God is evident, though God is present, though He's right there, if we'll just focus our attention on Him, we, like the Israelites, just can't seem to see Him. Notice verse 30, still in chapter 14. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and His servant Moses. And you often wonder, maybe, why did it take them to the point where God had to completely get rid of all of Pharaoh's army in order for them to finally recognize that He was with them, though He had already demonstrated His power to be with them? Now, here's what I want you to notice. Go back in the narrative for a minute into chapter 13. And I want you to notice two verses of Scripture, verse 21 and 22 of Exodus 13. And I want you to remind yourself of how it is they were being led out of this Egyptian bondage, literally. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. What's your point, Brian? My point is, all they had to do was look to the cloud, and they would have known that God was still with them. All they had to do was look at the evidence that He had already provided. He was already in plain sight. He was already there. There was a visible, physical, visual evidence that God was present with them. They just refused to see it. All they saw was the pursuit of Pharaoh. All they saw was the sea that was a barrier. All they saw was they were landlocked in as it relates to the situation that God had turned them in through their leader Moses. When God had provided them a cloud and a fire by night to always remind them that He was guiding and leading them and aiding them. And friends, I think my point simply is this, as it relates to that, is so often we choose not to see the evidence of God's presence in our lives. So often it's there, but because we just choose to see other things, we choose to focus on other things, we choose to give our attention to other things to the point that we don't see the evidences that are all around us. The presence of God is more prevalent than sometimes we realize, and even in those moments where we have doubt and we're wondering, why did God let me get into this, or why did this situation happen to me? Don't ever get convinced that God's presence has left us, if we'll but honor and serve Him. It's interesting, though, keep reading with me in the narrative of the book of Exodus. Because in chapter 15, the first part of the chapter is beautiful. They've experienced this situation here at the sea in chapter 14. They are led through that sea, right? and the guidance that God provides for them to escape Pharaoh and the destruction that came. And the first part of chapter 15 is this tremendous praise and celebration of God, and rightly so. Their eyes have finally clearly seen the presence of God. They're finally getting it, that God is with them, He will fight for them, and they're praising Him. But notice verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea when they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. A new obstacle, a new problem. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree when he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. And said, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in His sight, give ear to His commandments, and keep all His statutes, and I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where they were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the waters. I think sometimes in our lives, as long as things are good, as long as we're in the first part of chapter 15 where all is well and we feel that presence of God because things are going good in my life, there are no distractions, there's no challenges, there's no trial or difficulty to have to overcome, and we're kind of in that mode where we're willing to give God all the glory and praise in that moment. But then what happens when the next obstacle comes? They reverted right back to chapter 14. The very next issue arrives, and they've already forgotten the presence of God again. They've already forgotten the 10 plagues again. They've already forgotten how He was guiding them by cloud and by fire again. They've already forgotten how He parted the Red Sea and allowed them to walk through there. They've already forgotten how He'd already destroyed Pharaoh's army in their very presence. And they're already back to complaining again. Why is it that we pick and choose the moments we're willing to see the presence of God? When He's always there, He's always available, He's always ever present, He's not far from any of us, He's available and accessible to any and all who would come to Him, and the issue is not God. That's the point. The issue has never been God in these equations, in these texts that we've been reading. The challenge has always been their viewpoint and their perspective and their unwillingness to perceive the presence of God in those situations. There are going to be moments where we're challenged. There are going to be moments where we might have doubts and wonders, and why did this or that occur? But when we begin to feel God's presence in that moment, be cautious that when the next obstacle comes, and it will, or the next challenge, or the next difficulty, or the next problem to have to be solved comes, be sure to not revert back to the old path of complaining and troubled, and as if God's presence had left them. When the situation creates some doubt, God's presence is still there. And then once we've appreciated that, let's not forget it simply because a new obstacle has come. Go to chapter 16. Didn't know you were going to get the fast forward version of the Exodus today, did you? Chapter 16, verse 9. Once God's been proven, He's been proven. Then Moses spoke to Aaron, "Say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before the Lord, for He has heard your complaints." They haven't stopped, by the way. And now it came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Still there, right? And the glory of the presence of God's been there. But finally they go, you know what? Rather than complain, why don't we turn our eyes towards Jehovah? And so they've been commanded to do such, and they do. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying in verse 11, "I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So the first challenge in chapter 15 was they were thirsty, and they couldn't drink the bitter waters of Marah. We got to find a solution to this, and their solution at that point in time initially was to complain about it. Now they're hungry. What do? Do they remember the ability of God's presence and how He's helped them and aided? No, they began to complain again. So God tells them, listen, here's what I'm going to do. At night, I'm going to provide you meat, and in the morning, I'm going to fill you with bread. So it was that quails came, verse 13, came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. Now I want you to pause and think about something. That's why I separated the text on the chart. Normally, maybe if our minds think about manna and quail, and we think about the fact that the manna came in the morning and quail comes in the evening, maybe our mind would typically think that they would have experienced manna before quail. But you notice that's not how it happened? They experienced quail before manna. Now you say, well, what's the big deal, Brian? What's the point of that? Why does it matter? Well, here's why I believe it matters. Notice what happens. So remember, I'm going to give you quail at night, then in the morning I'm going to give you bread. Verse 13 says they experienced the evening quail. Now verse 14, when the layer of dew lifted, when the morning came, they already had dinner last night, morning's come, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? What do you mean, what is it? You were just fed last night exactly in the manner in which God told you He was going to feed you. He told you out of the cloud, at night I'm going to fill you with meat. I give you quail in order to accomplish that. Brother and friend, I'm not trying to be hypercritical of the Israelites here, but may I suggest to you that once their bellies had been filled the night before of the quail, when they got up the next morning and they see something on the ground, they should have immediately reacted, that's the bread God told us He was going to send. God had already been proven. And maybe I'm overanalyzing that, I don't know. But it sure seems to me to be inappropriate in some ways for them to say, what is it? What do you mean, what is this? It's the bread God told you He was going to send, and He'd already proven Himself to you the night before by sending you the quails that your bellies were filled with. Here's what I want us to appreciate. Once God's presence has been proven, then don't question it. Don't wonder, well, will He be here for me in this moment? Or will He be here for me in that moment? Yeah, I may have doubts. I may have questions. I may have challenges. I may have difficulties. I may feel like I just go from one obstacle to the next obstacle to the next obstacle. But none of that should convince me that the presence of God has left. And once God has evidenced Himself and the power that He has to be that ever-present God for us, then quit saying, what is this? Whatever's in front of me is, God is able to lead me and guide me and help me and aid me through whatever it is. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said, what is this? Or what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, this is the bread. Moses, this is the bread I was telling you about. This is the bread the voice of God said He was going to provide. That's what it is. That He's given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to one's need, and 1 omer for each person according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. And then the children of Israel did so and gathered some more and some less, based on that instruction that Moses had given. Friends, there should be no reason for us to ever doubt the presence of God. Because the presence of God doesn't mean we are absent of all troubles and challenges of earthly existence, right? In fact, the Bible, I think, tells us quite the opposite of that. It basically tells us that all of us are going to experience all things that come to humanity. There'll be some good and some bad, some pleasant and some unpleasant. But we need to be careful that we don't convince ourselves that the presence of God is only there when things are earthly good. That when my earthly situation, circumstance of life is wonderful or pleasant or peaceful, that's the only times that God is present. No, He's present all of the time. And He's proven Himself over and over and over again. And once I become confident in that and begin to build a trust in that, then don't let the things of this life convince us otherwise. Do we see God's presence? It took them quite a while and many challenges and many peaks and valleys, and they struggled. And I would hope we could learn from their example and not face those same kinds of continual challenges of exercising or appreciating the presence of God. But let me turn our attentions to the New Testament for a minute. Because I want us to at least make a connection to the manner in which that God's presence is available to us today. Because you might be able to argue, I suppose, well, Brian, you used that Exodus account, and there's a very real way that God is present with them. They had a big cloud, and they had this fire at night, and they had quail in the evenings and bread in the ground on the mornings, and there were some very real and evident ways that they should have been able to draw conclusions that God was ever present with them. And though God may address us and deal with us differently than He did with Israelites as He led them out of that Egyptian bondage, but I think there's still plenty for us to appreciate and know the presence of God. Notice verse 35 of Luke chapter 22. He said to them, when I sent you without money, bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? And so they said nothing. Now let's pause. Let me remind you of the history. Remember, there were a couple different times Jesus commissions His disciples to go out, right? And in that early commission, what we often call the limited commission, where they had a very small, limited focus of attention, He said, listen, don't take anything with you. And as you go, it'll just be provided for you. Don't take script, don't take money, don't take extra clothes, just go. And so He asked them that question in verse 35. When I sent you out that way, with no money, without any knapsack, no sandals, no, did you ever lack anything in that process? And they said, no, nothing. We didn't lack anything. But notice, I want you to notice verse 36. Then He said to them, but now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me, and he was numbered among the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. And so they said, Lord, look here, here are 2 swords. And He said to them, it is enough. Here's the point. Was Jesus with them less when they had to carry their own wallet and protect themselves and provide for themselves and take the things that were necessary for their travels with them? Did somehow the presence of Jesus mean more and was greater simply because there was one trip or one avenue of their work where He provided everything? They didn't have to carry money, shoes, clothes, nothing. Just go and you'll be provided for. And I think all of us will say, no, Jesus wasn't any less with them in the second commission, the greater commission that was going to come to them after His death, burial, and resurrection. Jesus' presence hadn't left them, and His availability to aid them and help, yes, He will physically is going to be gone. And my point is really very basic and simple here, friends. Sometimes in life, we're gonna feel like God is just, He's just providing and blessing and providing and blessing, and we'll feel it, we'll know it. And it'll be evident that, wow, He just gives more and more. Even circumstances and situations that I didn't necessarily even anticipate or expect. I remember Deborah and I had the kids at a restaurant years ago. They were little, and when they were little, that was kind of funny how life goes sometimes. When they were little, that was a rare thing. And as you get older, it changes, I guess, a little bit. But anyway, I can remember that we were always real disciplined about that when we'd go out, and we'd try to be careful as to how we ordered things and make sure we didn't overspend and that kind of thing. And we went to pay, and the lady said, "It's already been paid." And so then your mind goes, okay, who do we see in this restaurant? Who do we see in this restaurant? Who do we see, right? Who was it? And at the end of the day, it didn't matter. It was God blessing us through somebody that was in that restaurant that day. We didn't earn that. We didn't, you're right. It wasn't something that was expected. It wasn't due us in any fashion or form. It just happened. A blessing that came our way in the moment, and it just happened. But there have been lots of times where the bill has come and I had to what? I'd pay it, right? I'd pay it. Did that mean that God wasn't blessing me in that moment, but He was in the other? That because I didn't have to pay it, that God was blessing me, but when I did have to pay it, no. God was there and present and blessing me in both of those circumstances. His presence was equal in those circumstances, though they were different. And though I was handed something for nothing in one moment, it doesn't change the presence of God. And I hope you can see what I'm trying to get us to appreciate this morning. Sometimes I have to work and be diligent and accept my responsibilities and duty. And sometimes life is hard and it's challenging. And that doesn't mean God left me because there's work to be done. It doesn't mean God has departed and I can't see Him in plain sight, even when it is challenging and difficult, even when there are those moments. Ease doesn't mean God is there, and hardship means He's not there. That's what the world thinks, but it's not true. Were those waters really bitter? Sure. But should they have trusted God to provide without complaining? Should they have appreciated God in their plain sight? Yes. Would it have been confusing to get up in the morning and see these white flaky things laying on the ground? Sure. But should they have lost sight of the presence of God to the point where they're always confused about what He's doing and providing for them? No. Friends, we don't always have the exact perspective sometimes that we might think we should in order to help us know, is God present? Just accept the fact that He is. If I'm His child and I'm honoring Him and I'm striving to do everything that I can to be faithful to Him, He's there. He's there. Even in the simple acts of life that fulfill the purposes of God, He's there. You know, I say this just to kind of help us illustrate this. I've heard people say during some maybe large, big project or program or some great event, and maybe it even has some spiritual connotation to it, and people say, boy, you could feel the presence of God in this. It was just so wonderful and big and bold, and you could just feel God's presence. And I'm not arguing that. My point is simply this. I can feel God's presence in far less. Right? In much simpler kinds of things. Read with me. Hebrews 13, verse 1. Let brotherly love continue. Presence of God. No big program. No grand event. Just brotherly love. Presence of God. Don't forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels. Presence of God. Helping a stranger, being kind, brotherly love. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, and those who were mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Think about those who have challenges, physical difficulties that you might be able to aid with, and And be kind to those. There were some who were being imprisoned because of their faith. Others had freedoms and liberties because of their faith. Was God in the presence of one and not the other? No. He could come into the presence, though, even through those who could help and aid. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Don't be looking to take what somebody else has, including their spouse, verse 4, but in much more generic ways. Be content with such things as you have, and you can know the presence of God. For He Himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. In what ways will I know that God has never left or forsaken? Because there's some just enormous, majestic event? No. Because I've seen brotherly love in action. Because I've seen compassion towards those who need aid and assistance happen. Because I've seen folks who are willing to be content and live that kind of life that just recognizes that we can boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? What can man do to me? To take me outside the presence of God? Nothing. Nothing. The only one who can take you out of the presence of God is you. The only one who can cause me to not be able to see God in plain sight is me. And I think if I will simplify the presence of God a little more, if I will learn from situations like the Exodus, but not assume God has to be bold in a cloud and fire and send food out of the sky in order for me to appreciate His presence. I can learn the presence of God when brotherly love is present, when compassion is present, when people are content and not covetous of one another. When that's present, God is present. And He's right there. And He's not hiding from any of us. God isn't hiding in plain sight. He is just plainly in sight, if we'll just open our eyes. Will you experience the presence of God in your life? Will you honor Him, be obedient to Him, follow His will, appreciate the beauty and importance of what God can provide for you and your relationship as you build that covenant relationship with the Father? How can we help you do that? Can we aid you spiritually this morning, pray for you, assist you in some way to honor your God, to know His presence in a very real way in your life? If there's something we could aid you with today, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?